And we're back with BC based crime reporter Alex Zoltan discussing the criminal case surrounding the Drug User Liberation Front, which operated a quote unquote compassion club where they purchased drugs off the dark web and then tested them and then sold these drugs to a small number of users in Vancouver. Now, Alex, can you tell me more about the mechanics of this project? How did it actually work in practice?
So what they did is they established a cohort, and it was a group of a few dozen individuals. They had to be what they called active drug users. Many of them were already familiar with the founders of the DULF Club, so they were other drug users within the same social circle.
Okay. And did DULF have any pre existing research showing that compassion clubs are an effective solution for reducing overdoses and deaths?
Not in terms of heroin, cocaine, and meth. This was essentially an unprecedented experiment.
When you say not in terms of cocaine, heroin, and meth, does that, in some way recognize the fact that this system existed for cannabis?
Correct, exactly. But it had
O-
never existed for drugs of this nature.
Okay, so were they essentially adapting a pre-existing model that worked for cannabis and then using that for harder drugs like cocaine, meth, and so on?
I believe that was the underlying logic behind the launch of the operation, yes.
Okay, but then how did Dolph measure the impact of its compassion club? What research, if any, did they produce to illustrate that the club was making some kind of difference?
This is an excellent question. So they produced several self-published articles that were peer-reviewed, and largely it was qualitative studies. So they would ask these cohort participants what their experiences were in the program, such as this decrease the likelihood of you overdosing? Did this increase the likelihood of you receiving employment or housing, so on and so forth?
Okay, so they asked the drug addicts if receiving easier access to drugs would decrease the risk of overdose, and the addicts told them that yes, this is a great program. I mean, presumably there are some questions about this methodology in terms of whether or not this testimony is reliable.
Absolutely, because it's qualitative and it's also self published. Unsurprisingly, most of the drug addicts that they gave drugs to loved the program. But what I found very interesting about the qualitative studies that they did is that many of the participants said that they would have preferred stronger drugs. They did not think that the clean heroin, cocaine, and meth met their needs. And we can get into that later, but it's very interesting.
Well, let's get into that now. What kind of stronger drugs are we talking about? Is this, for example, fentanyl? Is this fentanyl or heroin that has been mixed with other things like benzodiazepines or sedatives? What do they want?
They wanted crack and fentanyl specifically.
Okay, so had the Compassion Club operated according to what these addicts wanted, it essentially would have given out free pharmaceutical grade, I mean, not free, but tested pharmaceutical grade fentanyl for them to consume.
That's correct. And there was a little bit of disagreement between the two co-defendants when questioned on this. Calicum said that he was not completely against the idea of offering fentanyl, but Nick said that she was.
Which is interesting because she seems to be the more radical voice here, yet she's taking the more restrained approach when it comes to the distribution of drugs. Why do you think there was that tension between these two figures?
I think that it may have been because Calicum testified first and he said that he was open to the concept, which may have given Nick's pause for thought, because I think that many people in the public, including myself, hearing that would have thought that offering fentanyl, whether it's tested or not, would kind of defeat the purpose of the entire experiment, given that it was to reduce the toxic drug supply, specifically fentanyl cut into heroin and cocaine.
And what measures were put in place to ensure that club members didn't simply resell their drugs to other people? And if there were any of these measures, were they effective?
There were none. The only measure that I could think of that you might employ would have been a witness model, but nothing of that nature had even been considered at that point. And actually, one of the DOLF participants was cross-examined during the DOLF trial, and she said that she actually did divert her supply to others. And yeah,
And in the research that Dolph produced, did they recognize the fact that this diversion of drugs was an issue and that it occurred?
yes, yeah, it was well known that the diversion occurred, and which also brings into question the results of the qualitative studies that we spoke about earlier. They boasted that nobody overdosed and nobody died, but if many of the drugs were being diverted, it's impossible to know who died amongst the unmonitored public to which these drugs were being diverted to.
Okay, so because they didn't measure diversion and they didn't measure the impacts of these diverted drugs in the greater community, we don't actually know the full unintended consequences and potential harms of this program. Now, when we get after the break, we're going to talk about how the DULF members faced arrest and what the fallout was from that development.